In one of my previous videos, I mentioned a movie starring Will Smith, Gene Hackman, and Jon Voight called Enemy of the State. That movie was based on a young attorney who came across a video that, if it became public, would send a very powerful congressman to jail. And it had other far-reaching consequences as well. So when this congressman found out that this attorney had this video, he set out on a campaign to discredit him just in case he decided to come forth with that information, to go public with the information. Mr. Dugan, the attorney for Liberty Bell Bank, from the very beginning, started out on a campaign to discredit me. The receiver, again, based on Mr. Dugan's efforts and based on misleading and distorted facts, was appointed sometime in March of 2014. I show you now a letter that was sent to the court, to the judge, by Mr. Dugan. I'm not going to read the letter to you, but I've highlighted evidence that clearly shows that he deliberately misled the judge. And you will find that the receiver knew he misled the judge and did nothing to set the record straight. This is a damning report about me and about how uncooperative I was when the receiver first came to my office. It states here, Mr. Rogers indicated to Mr. Melman that almost all the revenues was no longer going to LGR, but instead being received by the LGR Consortium, which is also paying the salaries of Mr. Rogers and 3 of his relatives. That is absolutely not true. In addition, and I have vivid proof of this untruth, I'm being kind and not calling it a lie, but you decide. When Mr. Melman attempted to access the bank accounts of LGR today online, he was denied access because either the passwords or username provided by Mr. Rogers were invalid. I have here an email from my controller who says in the email that they had asked me to go in because, again, I was fired, but they had asked me to go in and online to make sure that the payroll could get processed. The email from my controller says, the receiver logged on to the TD Bank account with information you gave them to try to wire the funds for payroll. They also took you off as the online administrator and tried to add themselves and me to the account, but it froze the online access. I believe only a check signer can have access to the online banking. Mr. Dugan writes a letter to the court saying that I gave an invalid password or invalid access code. My controller says that the reason Mr. Melman could not get access is that when he tried to go in and take me off, it froze the account, and they couldn't get access to it. Mr. Mehlman, when this came up in court, Mr. Mehlman knew that that was not the case, that I did not give him the wrong access code, but he never came forth to set the record straight. This is just one example of the deceit and misrepresentation given to the court by Mr. Mehlman and Mr. Dugan. In that same letter, and it gets a pretty long letter saying how uncooperative I was, he mentioned the fact that I would not let him into my private office. Well, we met in the conference room, and I told him I would give him access to anything that the court order deemed that I should. My attorney had told me at the time that the receiver was only the receiver for Lease Group Resources and not the other LGR companies. So my attorney told me I did not have to give them any information other than that which applied to Lease Group Resources. So when Mr. Mehlman began to ask me about University Copy Service, the LGR Consortium, I told him, I said, my attorney told me that you were only authorized as the receiver for Lease Group Resources and not the affiliate companies. But I gave him all the information he wanted, or that he asked for about Lease Group Resources, and told him I gave him access to my controller and said I would be in my office if he needed anything else. So I go to my office, I close the door, and began to work. Mr. Mehlman then comes to my office without knocking, opens the door, and I just deemed that as being disrespectful to me, to my integrity, to my privacy. And I told him, I said, you didn't knock. You just come busting into my office. I want you to leave. So his comment was, and I quote, I don't have to, but I will. And he left. But I did not deny him access as the attorney for Sterling Bank, or for Liberty Bell Bank, tried to tell the court that I was being uncooperative. He further states, in addition, Mr. Rogers continues to deny the receiver access to his private office. Not true. And Mr. Rogers will not allow him to change the locks to take physical control of the offices. Now, that subject never even came up about changing the locks. I believe they intended to change the locks, but they were very disappointed that during the course of our conversation, they found out that the building where Lease Group Resources operated was owned not by Lease Group Resources, but by me personally. So they could not take control of the building, even though they could take control of my company. The Liberty Bell Bank representative was surprised and disappointed, as was the receiver, to find out that the building was owned by me and not by the company. So maybe they intended to change the locks and lock me out, but evidently found out that they could not. But that subject never came up. But of course, the judge reads this, and I'm being painted as being uncooperative, dishonest, and so forth. Simply a litany of deceitful and untrue actions by the attorney for Liberty Bell Bank and the receiver. And there is much more to come.